Joining us once again is economist Dean Baker. He is the co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and he is the co-author of a new paper I found extremely interesting entitled Innovation, Intellectual Property and Development, A Better Set of Approaches for the 21st Century. The co-authors on that with Dean are Arjun Jayadev and Joseph Stiglitz. So first of all, Dean, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Secondly, you and I have talked a little bit on this show about intellectual property before. I think you're my thought leader on this subject, and I think a lot of people's. What is the basic thesis of this paper?
Well, we're trying to re-examine the logic of intellectual property, in particular in reference to developing countries. So just very simply, the rationale of intellectual property is to provide an incentive for innovation, for research, for creative work, with the idea being that the cost of copying it is going to be basically zero. So I'm Bill Gates and I come up with my operating system. Well, he didn't actually come up with it, but we'll leave that aside. I come up with my operating system, and once it's there, people all over the world can copy it, basically zero cost. So I'm out of luck. If I spent a lot of money developing it, I'm out of luck. And that's a story with all sorts of things, certainly with, artistic work, with prescription drugs, very big issue, to make it once it's been developed, that's very, very cheap. So the question is, how do you give people that incentive? And the way we've generally done it has been through intellectual property, that we grant people a patent, we grant people a copyright, which means that they have a monopoly. And Bill Gates will have me arrested if I start making copies of Windows all over the place and I don't pay him for it. Pfizer will have me arrested if I copy their drugs and give it out at whatever it costs me. I'll get arrested for that. So the logic of this is that that's a way to give incentives. And what we try and do in this paper is about, okay, what's the evidence that this is the best way to do that? And, again, we point out alternatives. I'll come back to that in a second. And in particular, in reference to the developing world, because for the time being, when we talk about intellectual property in reference to the developing world, it's about them paying us money, or Europe or Japan, because, the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for the most part in Latin America, they have relatively little by way of intellectual property at this point. They have, I should say, patents and copyrights, to be clear. So they're paying us. So we're talking about in reference to the developing world. And what we try to do is go, okay, this is one way that you could finance research and creative work, but there are other mechanisms, and these are all in use, so it's not as though we're pulling things out of the air. We talk about the idea that you can have direct funding, which, we have here in the United States. We have things like the National Institutes of Health, where we pay for research directly. We have things like the National Endowment of the Arts, Humanities. We pay for creative work. Other countries do that much more extensively than us. Again, you can argue whether it's a good or bad thing, but obviously we could do that. You could also have decentralized systems where you have a prize system, which has been done in different contexts, so you reward creative work. You also could have tax credits, which, again, we actually do in the United States. I raise this sometimes. You have tax credits on creative work, and people look at me like, well, that's Mars. I go, no, it's here in the United States. We have a tax deduction for charitable contributions. So people give money to a symphony or, some other artistic nonprofit that they like, they get a tax deduction for it. So we try to go through this. We go, look, there are alternatives, and there are good reasons for thinking that in developing countries in particular, they would want to pursue these alternatives and not have very strong patent and copyright laws, because that's going to both impede their own development of creative work and innovation, and also just mean they're going to be paying us a lot of money for no real good reason.
So it's a transfer of wealth also from the developing world to the developed world. I guess, Dean, one of the important things that people should be thinking about, one of the ways I think this paper and other things you've written should help open that thinking, is that even though my read of patent law in this country right now, and I'm no expert, but my read is that there've been a dramatic expansion of things that can be patented, but even so, it's understood, it sounds like a radical idea for, well, you can't patent Windows or whatever, but there are historically things that we've never patented, a speech political speech was never patented, or a better way of stacking boxes, or, you know, a million things you could think of if you set your mind to it. We had a category of things we patent, category of things we don't. And as you say, there was logic behind that once upon a time, which is if you patent things like mechanical inventions, for example, that will encourage people to come up with them because they'll make money, and then that will increase productivity and prosperity, and people will be better off and more jobs and all of that. But I think, you know, just to unpack your summary of the paper and the paper itself, you and your co-authors are basically saying there's a flaw in that argument now. One, as we move into the 21st century, and two, as we move into a more globalized economy. Am I summarizing reasonably well?
That's right. And, you know, part of the story here is, you know, as you mentioned, we've been making patents and copyrights longer and stronger. We've really done that blindly. It's not as though we have good research. And, you know, you see this most clearly in copyright. If you go back 40 years, copyright duration was 55 years. It's now 95 years, and incredibly, we made that retroactive, you know, because I always say incredibly because, you know, I could understand, okay, I have more incentive if I have a longer copyright today, but you can't give me more incentive 50 years ago, you know, so, but that's what we did. So, you know, we made them longer, we made them stronger in a variety of ways. One of the things we did was we make third parties responsible for copyright enforcement. So on my website, if I post something and, you know, someone sends me a notice saying, you know, oh, that infringes on my copyright. I mean, I post it myself. I mean, someone else has posted on my site. Then I'm responsible for taking it down. So if I have a customer, you know, think of, you know, a web intermediary. I have a customer. I have to take it down, or I'm liable. I haven't done anything. You know, they just post on my site. Why am I liable for it? You know, but that's the way we structured the laws. So there's a whole variety of ways. When you mention things being patented, you didn't used to be able to patent business methods. That's innovation in the last 20 or 30 years. Life forms. In fact, software didn't used to be patentable. That's, again, an innovation in the last 2 or 3 decades. So we've made these longer and stronger with really no evidence that would increase, you know, efficiency, productivity, lead to more innovation. We really have no evidence for that. And again, in the context of the developing world, it's about telling these developing countries, oh, you got to pay a lot of money now for software, for prescription drugs, for, you know, fertilizers, pesticides to make your agriculture more efficient. You have to pay a lot of money for these things that, you know, otherwise might be very cheap.
You know, I first of all, I can't resist saying that, you know, maybe the incentive in the retroactive 95 years is the incentive to invent a time machine now, to go back and invent something 50 years ago. But that aside, you know, it also seems to me, and I do want to get to the developing world, but it also seems to me that this trend towards being able to patent more and more, whether it's business processes or life forms or whatever, it seems to me functionally, even in this economy, in this country, in Western Europe and so on, that it is a way of reinforcing the hold that the, you know, if you want to call them the rentier class or the financial class or the haves, as opposed to the have-nots, reinforcing their economic hold on everyone else. I mean, it almost seems like a pro-inequality move, too. Am I reading too much into it?
I see it very much that way. I mean, I often use the example that, you know, Bill Gates, who apparently has just been displaced as the richest person in the world by Jeff Bezos, but in any case, he's incredibly rich. And you just go, okay, how much money would Bill Gates have if he didn't have a copyright on Windows and, you know, other Microsoft software? And obviously, the answer is he'd have an awful lot less money. So, to my view, this is a really big factor in the growth and inequality in the last 4 decades. And that certainly is a very good reason to examine whether we could have, you know, either weaker rules or alternative mechanisms. And, you know, again, the alternatives exist. So the real debate is, okay, what will we lose? Would it be notably less efficient if we relied more on alternatives? And, you know, again, it's not an either or. It's not as though we have to get rid of patents. We just might rely on them less. And, you know, again, I think there's a very strong argument that, you know, we'd be better off with the alternatives. But the main thing is, let's have the discussion, because we haven't been having it. We've just been doing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And elsewhere, you know, you've described it in certain ways, particularly when it comes to drug patents, as a kind of a tax, haven't you? Haven't you suggested in a way it's a tax on the use of certain things, including potentially life-saving drugs?
It's effectively a privately imposed tax. I think that's a lot. That is how we should think about it. So you have a lot of drugs. The new generation of cancer drugs. Many of them sell for over $100,000 a year. For the treatment. Almost invariably, the generic versions are available for less than $1,000. So we're talking about a tax, on the order of 10,000%. And, you're letting the patent holder, whether it's Pfizer, Gilead Sciences, whoever it might be, in effect, what you're saying is, you could tax people. And my reason for focusing on tax, it's not just the anti-tax sentiment. It's, I think there's real sloppiness in how people think about things. When I'm saying people, I think economist people. Because if the government were to say, okay, we want to spend another $50 billion on biomedical research, then everyone will go, how are you going to pay for that? Okay, fair enough. Okay, good enough. Okay, we go, okay, instead, we aren't going to spend anything. What we're going to do is we're going to tell, all the drug companies, Pfizer and Merck and Gilead and all the others, you go get patents. We'll give you long patents and charge people lots of money. Okay, how is that different? Do we want our politicians going, oh, look at that, I saved you $50 billion, you don't have to pay the taxes. Meanwhile, when you go out and get the drugs, you have to pay $100,000 for that doesn't make any sense. You didn't save us a penny. We end up paying much more in your route.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way of looking at it, especially, I interviewed you for a piece I did in The Nation on drug patents, and particularly the Zika vaccine that the Army has paid for, especially when, as it is the case, so many drug patents were developed at government expense, were developed in effect by the people themselves, and then drug companies were paid to develop them by the people, and then are given exclusive patent rights on it, which makes absolutely no sense at all. And parenthetically, I would argue Jeff Bezos has become the richest man in the world, thanks primarily to the internet, which was also developed at public expense. So why is that? Is there another way in the context of this? It's not intellectual property per se, but is there another way to look, for example, at the government-developed, quote-unquote, intellectual property or invention that is the internet? Is there another way to look at that and another way to address, let's say, the wealth and power of a Jeff Bezos?
Well, Jeff Bezos is a complicated case because, my big gripe on Jeff, well, there are many gripes. The most obvious one in my view is Amazon got a huge leg up by virtue of the fact they didn't have to pay sales taxes through most of their existence in most states, which there was zero rationale. Now, to be clear, they didn't break the law, at least as far as I know. Where they were required to pay the taxes, they did. But there was absolutely zero rationale that you had, a family clothing store where, sales of $200,000 a year, they have to collect the sales tax. Here's Amazon with sales in the tens of billions, and no, they don't have to do it. That made zero sense, and that was a huge, huge leg up. But yeah, they benefited from infrastructure that was developed at public expense. The internet, right up, the whole thing was done on the Defense Department dollar, and then it was turned over to the public. That was a great thing. But then you have companies like Bezos or Amazon in a position to capitalize on it. But, again, just getting back to the basic issue here, there's a real sloppiness in thinking that, we have, I would just say a fixation on government waste, which, we shouldn't want to see government waste. But, when you see, people jumping up and down, I remember the Washington Post a few years ago, it found that $100 million in Social Security payments had gone to people who were dead, and it wasn't fraud. They just didn't, people don't necessarily let the government know. They recovered half of it. They don't let someone know the moment they died. You go, but wait, this is a program that paid out like $4 trillion over that period. So it was, like 100% of its payments. You'd like waste to be zero, but it's not going to be. But that's the sort of thing you get when people look at the public sector. But then you go, okay, look at all the money we're giving the private sector through different channels, and suddenly there's no interest. And obviously we've given enormous benefits to Amazon and other companies through the development of the internet and other infrastructure. And, they reap the riches of it. And, as a result, Jeff Bezos is now the richest man in the world.
Right. Well said. And your paper, by the way, I just want to encourage people to read it. They can find it at cepr.net. Also comes up with some policy solutions for all of this, too, especially when it comes to developing countries. So we have about 30 seconds. Any last words you want to say on that before we say goodbye?
Well, I really hope we get people more interested in having copyrights, because people think like this is a quirky thing, and I'm going, no, this is hundreds of billions of dollars a year. There's almost nothing we have political fights over where there's more money at stake. I mean, everyone thinks their issue is important. I'm not saying any issue isn't. I'm just saying there's a huge, huge amount of money at stake here, and if you're not paying attention, you're giving a lot of money away. And of course, you're talking about drugs. It's people's lives as well.
All right. Well, I can't add to that because that's a great summary, but economist Dean Baker, as always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me on.